The sound of 1929 was not the jazz of the speakeasies or the hum of the new Ford engines, but the rhythmic, neurotic chatter of the ticker-tape machine. It was a Western Union Type 3A, a glass-domed oracle that spat out thin ribbons of paper, translating the chaotic energy of the New York Stock Exchange into ink and numbers. By 10 in the morning on October 24th, the machine was already gasping. The paper ribbons, normally crisp and orderly, began to pile up on the floors of brokerage houses like drifts of white snow in a dying forest. There was a metallic heat to the air, the smell of ozone and friction as the internal gears ground against the sheer volume of the panic. Men in three-piece wool suits, their collars already wilted by sweat, stared at the glass domes with the hollow eyes of sailors watching a lighthouse light go out in a storm. On the floor of the exchange, the great bull market was being dismantled by 1,000 screaming mouths. This was not a metaphorical collapse, it was a physical assault. The air was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of adrenaline. Brokers didn't just trade, they collided, their bodies slamming into one another in a desperate bid to find a buyer who no longer existed. The noise was described by those present as a primal roar, a sound that transcended human speech and became a vibration felt in the marrow of the bone. It was the sound of a decade's worth of optimism being shredded by a mechanical failure of faith. Outside, on Broad Street, the crowd began to gather not out of curiosity, but out of a gravitational pull toward the epicenter of their own ruin. They stood in the gray light of a New York autumn, looking up at the neoclassical facades of the financial district, as if the stone itself might start to liquefy.
Here, take this.
There was a terrifying politeness to the early hours of the crash, a stunned silence that blanketed the sidewalk, even as the roar intensified inside the building. People gripped their newspapers, the headlines already obsolete by the time the ink was dry, watching the messengers run out of the exchange with faces as white as the ticker tape they carried. The city felt smaller, the skyscrapers taller and more indifferent as the invisible architecture of credit began to buckle. The ticker tape was now lagging nearly 2 hours behind the actual trades. This was the true horror of the morning. The information was a ghost. A man might look at the tape and see his fortune halved, not knowing that in the reality of the trading floor, it had already vanished entirely. He was reacting to a past that was already dead, making decisions based on a phantom reality. The delay created a temporal rift where men lived for hours in a state of perceived wealth while being functionally bankrupt. It was a mechanical betrayal by the very technology that had promised them a seat at the table of the gods. By noon, the police had been called to manage the growing throng outside the exchange, but there was no violence to manage, only a collective paralyzed grief. The roaring Twenties had been built on the idea that the future was a commodity that could be bought on margin, a 10% down payment on a dream that would never end. But as the sun reached its zenith over Wall Street, the shadow of the exchange building lengthened across the street, dark and cold. The collective realization was dawning that the margin was being called and the debt was more than anyone could pay. Somewhere in the frantic movement of the floor, a single realization began to take root. The floor was not the bottom. To understand the rupture, one must look at the hands of Arthur Penhaligon, a man who had never seen the inside of a boardroom but felt the pulse of the market in his very fingertips. Arthur was a junior accountant for a textile firm, a man of modest means who lived in a rented walk-up in Queens with a wife who still mended his socks. In 1926, Arthur had discovered the margin. It was a magic word, a linguistic lever that allowed him to control 10 shares of Radio Corporation of America for the price of one. To Arthur, the stock market was not a system of finance, it was a ladder made of paper. And for 3 years, he had climbed it with the agility of a man who believed the sky had no ceiling. He spent his evenings under a single yellow bulb, calculating his theoretical wealth on the margins of his ledger books, watching his $500 investment bloom into $5,000. The world Arthur inhabited was one of shimmering surfaces and the intoxicating scent of newness. It was an era of the permanent plateau, a phrase coined by economists to suggest that the boom was not a cycle, but a new state of human existence. Every week, a new marvel was birthed: the vacuum cleaner, the radio, the electric refrigerator. These were not mere appliances. They were totems of a civilization that had finally conquered the scarcity of the past. Arthur bought a radio on the installment plan, a mahogany-cased RCA that sat in his parlor like a silent, expectant deity. He listened to the grain reports and the jazz bands, but mostly he listened for the stock updates, his heart fluttering with every fractional gain in Big Steel or Anaconda Copper. In this world, the cab driver gave stock tips to the socialite, and the bootblack advised the banker. It was a democratic delusion where everyone was an insider because the inside had expanded to include the entire nation. The psychology of the era was a fever dream of upward mobility, fueled by the easy credit of the Federal Reserve and the boundless arrogance of a post-war superpower. Arthur felt a kinship with the titans of industry, Mitchell, Wiggins, Whitney, believing that their genius was a tide that would lift his small wooden boat along with their gilded yachts. He had stopped saving money in the traditional sense, seeing the bank as a tomb of capital that could be put to work in the vibrant, churning waters of the exchange. The micro-history of Arthur was mirrored in millions of homes across the Atlantic seaboard and deep into the Midwest. Farmers who had struggled through the post-war agricultural slump took out mortgages on their tractors to buy blue-chip stocks, convinced that the industrial boom would eventually trickle down to the soil. There was a sense that the old rules of gravity, of work, of sweat, of tangible value had been repealed by the sheer velocity of the ticker tape. The economy had become a perpetual motion machine, a shimmering carousel that spun faster and faster, blurring the faces of the riders until they were all one single ecstatic expression of greed. Arthur's wife, Margaret, expressed a quiet, lingering fear that the money didn't feel heavy enough, but her voice was drowned out by the nightly broadcasts of prosperity. By the summer of 1929, the air in New York was thick with a strange electric tension. The market had become erratic, with shakedowns that sent tremors through the brokerage houses, but each time the bull recovered, charging higher than before. Arthur ignored the warnings, the whispers of saturated markets and declining construction. He was looking at the Chrysler Building rising into the clouds, a silver needle stitching the earth to the heavens. He believed with the fervor of a religious zealot that the building would never stop rising. He didn't see the cracks in the foundation, the way the consumer debt was piling up like dry brush in a drought-stricken forest. The week before the crash, Arthur had taken his last $200, money intended for Margaret's winter coat and the coal bill, and placed it on a speculative oil stock. He stood in the brokerage office, surrounded by the blue smoke of cigars and the frantic clicking of the keys, feeling like a conqueror. He was part of the greatest wealth creation engine in the history of the world, a participant in a secular miracle. He went home that night and kissed Margaret, telling her that by Christmas they would be looking at houses in the suburbs. He fell asleep to the sound of the wind rattling the window pane, unaware that the wind was shifting. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, began not with a bang, but with the sound of 1,000 telephones ringing simultaneously. It was the sound of the margin call, the terrifying demand for cash that most investors simply did not have. As the doors of the New York Stock Exchange opened at 10 a.m., the atmosphere was already one of slaughter. There was no opening rally, no hopeful pause. There was only a vertical drop into the abyss. Sell orders were piled so high on the specialists' desks that they looked like funeral pyres. Stocks like Westinghouse and General Electric, the pillars of the modern age, began to lose $10, $20, $30 a share in minutes. The trading floor became a theater of the grotesque. Men who had been millionaires at breakfast were paupers by lunch, their faces contorted into masks of disbelief. The roar of the previous Thursday had returned, but it was higher-pitched now, a collective shriek of panic. Brokers were seen collapsing from exhaustion, their clothes torn, their collars ripped away in the melee. One witness described a man standing in the center of the floor, his hands over his ears, screaming, "Stop it! Stop it!" at the ticker tape as if it were a living monster. The tape itself was now hours behind, a useless trail of white paper that served only to mock the men who slipped and slid upon it. In the visitors' gallery, Winston Churchill sat and watched the spectacle with the detached fascination of a historian witnessing the fall of Rome. Below him, the machinery of capitalism was disembodying itself. The Rockefeller buy, a rumored intervention by the richest man in the world to prop up the market, never materialized with enough force to stem the tide. The bankers who had met in secret at 23 Wall Street just days before, led by Richard Whitney, found that their millions were like pebbles thrown into a Category 5 hurricane. They could no longer command the sea to retreat. The sea had become a wall of water, and it was crashing over the levee. The panic spread from the floor to the streets, and from the streets to the cables that spanned the globe. In London, Paris, and Berlin, the tickers began to transmit the infection. The interconnectedness of the new world, once hailed as its greatest strength, became the conduit for its destruction. Every sell order in New York triggered a liquidation in Chicago. Every bank failure in the Midwest sent a shockwave back to Manhattan. The system was failing because the trust that fueled it had evaporated in a single morning. Value, it turned out, was nothing more than a collective hallucination, and the world had suddenly woken up. By 2 p.m., the volume of trading had reached such a frantic pace that the machines simply jammed. The ink ran dry, the paper tore, and for brief, terrifying intervals, the world had no idea how much it was worth. In the brokerage houses, the big boards could not be updated fast enough. The clerks, their arms aching from chalking in the plummeting numbers, eventually gave up and just drew long, downward slashes across the slate. Men stood in the back of the rooms, weeping openly, while others stared into space with the 1,000-yard stare of combat veterans. The air was filled with the sound of tearing paper, thousands of stock certificates being rendered into worthless confetti. The climax of the day was not a single event, but a cumulative weight. It was the moment when the limit was reached, the point where there were no more buyers at any price. For certain stocks, the bid price simply vanished. You could offer a share of a once mighty railroad for $1, and no one would take it. This was the true face of the crash, not just a loss of money, but a total collapse of the marketplace itself. The exchange had become a void, a black hole that was sucking the liquidity out of the entire American experiment. As the closing bell finally rang at 3 p.m., a sound that usually signaled the end of a day's labor, it sounded instead like a tolling bell for a funeral. The silence that followed the closing bell was more terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that settled over the financial district like a shroud. The floor of the exchange was a graveyard of paper, ankle-deep in discarded ticker tape and order slips. Maintenance crews began the grim task of sweeping up the wreckage, their brooms making a dry, scratching sound on the marble. The men who had been screaming hours before now sat on the steps of the sub-treasury building, their heads in their hands, looking like statues of grief. There was no celebration of the end of the day, no rushing to the bars. There was only a slow, dazed dispersal into the cooling October evening. That night, the lights in the skyscrapers stayed on, but they were not the lights of industry. They were the lights of the death watch. In thousands of offices, accountants and lawyers worked through the night to tally the losses, their green eye shades illuminated by desk lamps. The news began to filter out to the rest of the country via the radio, the same radios that had been bought on the installment plans that were now impossible to fulfill. In Queens, Arthur Penhaligon sat in his parlor, the mahogany RCA silent for once. He had received the call from his broker at 4:30 p.m. His account was gone. His $5,000 was gone. The $200 for the winter coat was gone. He sat in the dark, his hands trembling, realizing that he didn't even own the chair he was sitting in. The rumors of suicides began to circulate almost immediately, taking on a mythic quality that would define the era. While the image of brokers leaping from windows was largely an exaggeration of the press, the reality was no less grim. There were men who went into their garages and turned on the engines of their new cars. Men who walked into the Hudson River with their pockets full of stones. Men who simply disappeared, leaving their hats and coats on the piers. The psychic blow was more than many could bear. They had tied their sense of self-worth so tightly to the ticker tape that when the tape broke, they broke with it. The American dream had been revealed to be a precarious gamble, and they had lost everything on a single roll of the dice. By Wednesday morning, the breadlines had not yet formed, but the seeds of the Great Depression were already germinating in the cold, hard soil of the city. The banks, sensing the coming storm, began to tighten their vaults, refusing loans and calling in debts. The multiplier effect, which had fueled the boom, now worked in reverse with devastating efficiency. The textile firm where Arthur worked announced a 20% wage cut by noon. The construction on the new luxury apartments down the street was halted, leaving a skeletal frame of steel to rust in the salt air. The velocity of the economy had ground to a halt, and the friction was generating a coldness that no coal fire could warm. The immediate aftermath was characterized by a strange, desperate nostalgia. People walked the streets looking for the world of 1928, unable to comprehend how it could have vanished in a matter of hours. They looked at the gleaming storefronts and the bright advertisements with a new, cynical eye. The magic of the market had been exposed as a shell game, and the magician had fled the stage. There was a sense of betrayal that cut across class lines, a feeling that the elites had led the common man into a slaughterhouse. Margaret Penhaligon did not scream when Arthur told her the news. She simply went to the kitchen and began to count the remaining cans of soup, her face hardening into a mask of survival. As the week wore on, the weather turned bitter, a premature winter that seemed to mock the summer of prosperity. The newspapers tried to offer hope with headlines like "Recovery expected soon" and "Fundamentals are sound." But the people on the street knew better. They could feel the emptiness in their pockets and the hollow space where their future used to be. The ticker tape machines, once the heartbeat of the nation, were now seen as instruments of torture, their glass domes reflecting the gray, leaden sky. The city was still there. The buildings were still standing, but the soul of the era had been extinguished. The legacy of October 1929 did not end with the closing of the banks or the election of 1932. It etched itself into the very DNA of the American psyche. It created a generation of collectors, people like Arthur and Margaret, who would spend the rest of their lives hoarding bits of string, washing out tin foil, and hiding cash under floorboards. The trauma of the crash transformed the concept of risk from a thrill into a sin. The exuberant, reckless optimism of the 1920s was replaced by a somber, guarded realism that would define the New Deal era and beyond. The crash was the moment the United States grew up, losing its adolescent belief in its own invincibility and replacing it with a weary, hard-won wisdom. The physical landscape of the country was altered by the crash as surely as if a tectonic plate had shifted. The half-finished skyscrapers became Hoovervilles in some cities, or stood as hollow monuments to a vanished ambition. The Dust Bowl, while a climatic event, was exacerbated by the financial desperation of farmers who had overplowed their land to pay off the debts incurred during the boom. The crash proved that the economy was not a separate mechanical entity, but a living, breathing ecosystem where a tremor in a Manhattan boardroom could cause a starvation in a Kansas farmhouse. It forced the creation of the SEC, the FDIC, and a social safety net that we still navigate today, built on the ruins of the free market utopia. Yet, as the decades passed, the sensory details of that day, the smell of the ink, the roar of the floor, faded into the sepia tones of history books. The ticker tape machine became a museum piece, a quaint relic of a slower, more primitive time. We began to believe, once again, that we had mastered the machine. The permanent plateau was rebranded as the new economy, and the manual ticker was replaced by high-frequency algorithms that trade in nanoseconds, invisible to the human eye. The margin returned under a dozen different names, fueled by a new generation of believers who looked at the rising charts and saw a ladder to the stars. The transformation was complete. The crash became a ghost story we told ourselves to feel safe, a reminder of a dark age that we had supposedly evolved past. We traded the wool suits for hoodies and the marble floors for server farms in the desert, but the underlying mechanics of faith remained unchanged. The market still runs on trust, and trust is still a fragile, combustible thing. We live in an age where the roar is silent, carried over fiber optic cables, but the vibration is still there, humming in the background of our digital lives. We watch the screens with the same hollow eyes as the men who watched the glass domes in 1929, waiting for the oracle to speak. The implicit connection to our modern world lies in the terrifying speed of the flash crash and the algorithmic cascades that can wipe out trillions in the blink of an eye. We have built a system that is infinitely faster and more complex than the Western Union Type 3A, but it is still vulnerable to the same primal panic. The margin is now a global web of derivatives and leverage that defies human comprehension, a paper architecture that dwarfs the skyscrapers of Wall Street. We walk the same streets, looking up at the same stone facades, unaware that the air is once again thick with the smell of ozone and friction. The ticker tape is still running, and it is still lagging behind the reality of our own fragility.